2, we're going to be looking at Bill Ruger, his support for magazine bans, his times defending the Second Amendment and being opposed to gun registration and confiscation. This is a complicated topic. I have lots of sources towards the end of the video, and we're going to be examining the famous Ruger letter, though I'm going to refer to him as the Ruger letters because no one ever talks about the April 12th one. And this presentation, before I start, it's October 15th, 2025, historical gun weeb here. It's going to take a couple days to post it. Just keep that in mind. But there's a lot of background I'm going to look at, 1960s to 80s, to try to help everyone understand what it was like then for guns. And on top of that, we're going to be looking at Ruger's involvement defending gun rights and promoting gun control, with a background on motives and history on Bill Ruger's pro-gun and anti-gun sides. Again, it's a complicated topic. We're going to start with the 1965 Ruger Company testimony in a congressional hearing. Then, 1975 Bill Ruger himself's testimony in a congressional hearing, followed by the 1989 Ruger letters. We're going to get into Neil Knox a bit, and why he's significant and why what he says is significant and why we should believe it or not. Backlash and damage control by Ruger. Briefly, we'll examine 1990s to 2001, but not that much. And then we're going to go into my bias analysis. Any gun guy talking about this is going to have a bias. That's just the way it is. And this is a history. Bill Ruger's been dead over 20 years. This is a historical analysis. You guys are going to be able to make your own opinions based on the facts of this video. You might agree with me. You might disagree with me. You're going to have a bit of my opinion. That's just the way it is. I'm not critiquing modern Ruger. They sell suppressors, ARs, mags, etc. that Bill Ruger would be pissed hearing that his company is now doing. So keep that in mind. This isn't about modern Ruger. And to get some background on Ruger firearms, I decided most of what we're going to look at is stuff Bill Ruger testified for the background of his company to Congress in 1975. He brought some guns to the hearing and said, quote, "This first gun on my right over there was an informal target pistol and actually the cornerstone of the company when it started in 1949. This was talking about the Ruger Mark I, or whatever it was called before the Mark I. If they called it something else, I don't really give a shit. It's what became the Mark II, Mark III, Mark IV. Lots of people know that gun. Lots of people have trained with it if their father ever took them shooting, because it's a very common gun nowadays. The Speed 6 was, quote, for sale to police departments. We have it in our line primarily in an effort to obtain police business, end quote. He sold these Ruger revolvers. Later, based on the advertisements, he had intent on civilians carrying them, whether it was for concealed carry or more likely hunting. You know, that's up to people to decide based on the advertisements. They should be in the video right about now for y'all. And he also said, in regard to the single actions, quote, "We realized these guns were very much wanted by Americans who lived in the West, primarily collectors, people who in general like to practice but nevertheless romanticize firearm for camping, fishing, and hunting trips, and so forth. And this gave birth to our single action revolvers, which are made in .22 caliber, end quote." And he also made later, at least, though I think at this time he did too, though he didn't bring specific attention to it, he also had bigger calibered single actions that were great for hunting. I know a lot of people who've hunted with the Ruger Blackhawk, the few that I do know who are into handgun hunting. And now I'm going to go into a little bit of other stuff that I know from other research. He made affordable American firearms at a time when imports were usually the cheap option or used guns. He reintroduced casting using wax. Reminds me of the last wax method sculptures used 2 to 4,000 years ago. Salesmen were said to run over Ruger Security 6 revolvers with their cars, then shoot the guns afterwards to prove they are reliable and, quote, comp-proof. May not be true. I thought it was Fudlore, but I've seen some articles talking about it. Nothing of the era talking about it, but I've seen some reputable places talking about it. One of them will be in the sources. And a little bit of background to 1960s gun law before we go into the 1965 hearing. In 1934, National Firearms Act was passed, so machine guns, short-barreled rifles, short-barreled shotguns are regulated with $200 registration via a tax stamp. If you don't have the tax stamp with your fingerprints and photographs submitted to the government, you're going to jail and you do not pass go. U.S. military surplus imports were banned from import after lobbying from U.S. gun manufacturers. SAMI's, the group specifically, they had some of the most major U.S. gun manufacturers like Colt, Winchester, Remington. We're going to look at them a little bit later, but not that much. They're not the focus, but they're significant because of the Ruger letter. U.S. manufacturers are currently lobbying Congress to ban all military surplus imports, wanting exemptions for a mail-order bans that are being proposed for, quote, sporting rifles and shotguns, end quote. We're going to skip some info due to time, but you get the idea. 65 gun regulation was different, and Congress is also looking at targeting military surplus guns, cheap guns, and mail-order firearms because of the JFK assassination. And specifically in this, we're going to be looking at what Edward Noland said. He is the Ruger sales manager. He testified in this congressional hearing on behalf of the Ruger Company, and he said Ruger opposed Senate Bill 1592, a gun control bill, because non-residents would be prohibited from buying handguns out of state. Though Edward wanted to honor the sale of out-of-state buyers' laws, such as permits, and he tried to convince 2 senators in the hearing to understand it would harm sportsmen if it was prohibited, and those 2 idiots just could not understand that at all. He at one point said, quote, "I have said over and over again on behalf of my company and behalf of myself, we have tried for 4 years to come up with an answer to this problem, and we do not like it, and we know you do not like it." Ruger's been going to Congress for 4 years. I don't know if it was Edward Noland each time or Ruger himself. And he was likely getting annoyed as 1/3 of his speech was him just trying to get to understand it will harm the sportsmen if they cannot buy handguns out of state. That's going to harm them. He could not get it through their thick skulls. He tried dramatically, though they finally kind of understood a bit towards the end. And now we're going to go a little bit into some of the more anti-gun side, and depending on how compromising with Congress for 4 years seems to you, now we're going to look more on the anti-gun side. He was for a police notification with firearm purchases, with an affidavit. That was his position. That was Ruger's position. He came in there knowing that ahead of time when he's talking about it, so I'm sure Bill Ruger knew he was going to say that and a lot of the stuff. And when he was asked about military surplus guns, he said, quote, that tariffs might be raised to bring the U.S. price range of these surplus rifles more in line with the cost of new rifles. Such an increase in price would surely not injure foreign manufacturers, since the surplus rifles were made years ago. Such a higher tariff would not even present a hardship to the poor father who wants to buy a rifle for his son, since there's a large number of used firearms always available on the open market. Such an increased duty might be levied so that the cost of these rifles would be close to their original cost. Doing so would prevent many advantages, but the principal advantage is that by getting the dirt cheap guns off the market, the traffic will slow down dramatically. End quote. It's still better than SAMI, who wanted to ban all military surpluses, and 58 even said foreign imports in general were part of the problems that U.S. gun manufacturers were having. Sammy went a lot worse than this, but this definitely is anti-gun, wanting extremely high tariffs on surplus guns and police notification with gun purchases. I think we could all agree there, but I will say it's actually better than Sammy, though. Sammy was really aggressive, and we actually don't have much time to go into specifics, but they were aggressively lobbying for 10 years to get milsurps banned, which they did get. In 1968, when the Gun Control Act is passed, Sammy got their wish, and the people mentioned by Samuel Cummings, a military surplus importer, he mentioned specifically Colt, Remington, and Winchester, though if you look at the statements from the time, you'll also see that there was additionally companies such as Mossberg, High Standard, etc. And imported firearms under the Gun Control Act now have to have a sporting purpose to be imported. No more Saturday night specials could be imported, but they could be domestically made. In 1975, Saturday night specials are the hot topic of that gun control hearing, though it never passed. It was talking about ways to ban Saturday night specials, and they were pushing a ban. Apparently, the Nixon administration wasn't interested in doing it, but you get the idea for now. And non-military surplus firearm imports were still relaxed at the moment. You couldn't get small guns, you couldn't get full autos imported, no Saturday night specials, but domestic production was exempt, just like Sammy wished, and there's no mail-order firearms anymore, other than antique guns, unless you're an FFL. And now we're going to look at the 1975 hearing, now that you have a little bit of background. This is Bill Ruger himself testifying. The pro-gun side of this, he testified to Congress and said, quote, "We employ approximately 800 people making quality rifles and handguns for sporting, police, and military purposes," end quote. And he used this opportunity to talk a lot about opposing gun restriction in general. He said, quote, "I think very relevant the equating of handguns with crime is a subject which concerns millions of Americans properly. These millions of Americans have had a traditional, if not constitutional, right to firearms, and it has been a facade of American life for 200 years. D.C. City Councilman John A. Wilson proposed a bill," oh, this is another quote here, quote, "D.C. City Councilman John A. Wilson proposed a bill which would have required the police to confiscate the 35,000 handguns and 16,000 shotguns already registered in D.C. When it was pointed out to the councilman that such a bill would break faith with the obviously law-abiding citizens who registered their guns under existing D.C. law, he said, quote, "That doesn't bother me. I didn't promise them anything," end quote of that quote. Then he goes on to say registration leads to confiscation. That's what Bill Ruger starts talking about. Registration leading to confiscation. He's against this type of stuff. This is some pretty pro-gun stuff. I think we could all agree here. He also said in an interview in the 80s or 90s that I think is relevant here, that, quote, "The Constitution is there to protect the citizens from the government. Governments are automatically and inevitably tyrants," end quote. So a lot of pro-gun he talked about 75, and a little bit later I mentioned just because it was relevant. But now to the anti-gun side of these hearings. 1975, Ruger testified to Congress when talking about the pistols. He showed some Ruger pistols and said, "These ones, quote, all conform to the existing criteria applied by the Treasury Department for foreign imports. We are not here concerned in the least way with so-called Saturday night specials," end quote. And he starts kind of stroking his dick about it in the hearing, that they meet the foreign import requirements with all their guns. And he said, quote, "I am delighted to be able to sit here as an American citizen and know that these firearms we manufacture conform perfectly with the spirit of this Federal Gun Control Act, and that these guns, which were made for lawful and legitimate uses, end quote. And just a note, revolvers with barrels under 3 inches would be prohibited if U.S. manufacturers had to apply these standards. Same thing with his guns, if he had any that were under 3 inches. I don't know if the Speed 6 was under 3 inches all the time, but I know nowadays they have some that are. But it also kind of shows that a lot of people were thinking about domestic guns applying to the import gun standards. He's fine with it, as everyone can see here, because his guns already meet those requirements. And that would mean no more subcompact guns, definitely due to barrel length requirements with imports. That would mean lighter weight guns are going to be a bit harder because of the point system. We're not going to get into the point system and all that stuff, but imported firearms, there's a reason why it's harder to get foreign-made smaller guns, foreign-made guns in general, because they have to adhere to these standards. And now we're going to get a little bit into the Ruger letters, but before we do, we're going to get into a little bit of background. SAMI and Ammo Manufacturers Institute, SAMI, Small Arms and Ammunition Manufacturers Institute, they're a group of gun manufacturers that have ammo safety standards, but here are significant for their push on a magazine ban, likely pushed by Bill Ruger. Is Bill Ruger, March 30th, had this position, then all of a sudden in April, SAMI magically supports it, and you have a couple different people saying Ruger got SAMI to support it. We're going to mainly go into one, and the Ruger, and I think in this time I'll probably list the 1989 SAMI members with a picture, so everyone should see it here as long as I was able to dig it up. The Ruger letter was written March 30th. The Ruger had a letter sent to him March 28th by Senator Howard, some shit, can't pronounce his name, wanting Ruger to stop selling, quote, assault weapons, end quote, to civilians, specifically referring to the Mini 14. The April 12th letter replied to that, though it was Ruger's general counsel, Steve Sansonetti, who now runs NSSF, by the way, and takes stances opposite of what he said on behalf of Ruger. Though, if you look in even Gun Week 1989, it looks like he didn't really agree with the positions he was saying, but we'll get into that later. And Bill Ruger, April 12th, 1989, is in the hospital, so he has his general counsel write it, in that letter, there's a lot of terms there, that stuff Bill Ruger used in interviews in the 90s, so he definitely had a hand, even though he was in the hospital, with drafting it a bit at least. And a little bit of background to 1980s gun laws. Firearms Owners Protection Act is passed, machine guns are banned, ammo no longer has to be signed for to buy it and recorded by each gun dealer each time they sell some ammo. They don't have to do that anymore. Additionally, 1989, quote, assault rifles are banned from import. Or I believe it was, quote, assault style rifles or assault type rifles. They used a whole bunch of different terms then. Bill Ruger uses a couple of them definitely through the 90s, but assault weapons is not, it's not what they said back then, usually, keyword usually. I made a video before on Senate Bill 386, which banned the Mini 14 and no grandfathering to outside of current owners. And the video also covered 1989 Senate Bill 747, which had grandfathering if a 4473 is filled out. See the previous video on this topic, but that's a little bit of background to the 1989 gun laws being proposed to help understand in fairness a little bit of why he might have suggested appeasing the gun control lobby with a magazine ban. Though, also keep in mind, it was one of the best times for gun purchasers in terms of the market, but even though machine guns were banned, they were still cheap and affordable for the pre-ban machine guns. It was probably one of the best times for collectors because you had foreign guns and you had a lot of cool stuff still. Mil-Serps were freshly unbanned in the 80s. So now we're going to get on to the March 30th letter. A lot of stuff to point out in this letter. I'll probably show parts of it here and there in the video, but states regulating, quote, large capacity magazines, end quote, is the best way to deprive drug lords of their firepower and protect the rights of hunters. Targets magazine bans instead of, quote, assault rifles, end quote. Defines semi-autos in an accurate manner. He's not demonizing them in this letter, but legitimizing them a little bit and defending semi-autos is a hunting and collector's arm. So he's not legitimizing assault rifles, but he's legitimizing semi-autos. And unlike the April 12th letter, he doesn't try to make their rifles seem less scary than the, quote, military type, end quote. He's not targeting imports or Colt's AR-15, which he does in the next video. It seems both letters Steve wrote were more aggressive, but he also likely had to clean up Ruger's mess, as Bill Ruger didn't appear to make that many other statements that year that I could find. Though April 12th, it was not wrote by Ruger, and used terms Ruger used, not Steve, who we'll just look into that and I'll explain afterwards more. April 12th, there's a lot of critiques in this letter. Calls the Colt AR-15 a, quote, military-type semi-automatic rifle, end quote. And he said, quote, influx of imported military-type assault rifles and the advent of large-capacity magazines, end quote, is what he was blaming a lot of stuff on. So he's blaming foreign guns and aftermarket magazines or large-capacity magazines in general, depending on where you look specifically in the letter. And he implies other legitimate sporting rifles are ones made by, quote, Remington, Winchester, and Browning, end quote, who are all SAMI members, who Sammy's backing them up on the magazine ban, so it makes sense. He's kind of trying to help SAMI out and legitimize their rifles too. And in this letter, Ruger's general counsel, Steve Sansonetti, says there's no plans to increase production of the Mini 14, quote, regardless of the motives of Colt discontinuing its AR-15 military-type semi-automatic rifle, and their action is not a precedent to discontinue legitimate sporting firearms, end quote. So he's again showing legitimate sporting firearms are different from the AR-15 military-type semi-automatic rifle. So even if his argument fails, they're going to have that in the back of their head, that they're different. He calls imports, quote, military-type semi-automatics, end quote, as well. He says the Colt was advertised as a, quote, military look-alike, and it's not Ruger's market, end quote. It's hilarious, as if you look in their law enforcement catalogs, which very quickly were often given to civilians at gun shops when the catalog's not the newest years anymore. It's funny, as they advertise in multiple catalogs the M77 Ruger bolt-action rifle in law enforcement catalogs as a rifle, quote, increasingly selected as a counter sniper rifle for special forces, end quote. Steve also says in the reply, quote, what has changed in recent years is the influx of military-type assault rifles and the advent of large-capacity magazines on the aftermarket as accessories to legitimize semi-automatic sporting rifles, end quote. So he's, again, blaming foreign guns which he claims to not be they later, just a couple months later, actually months later, say they don't support foreign import bans. But keep this quote in mind. He's blaming the influx of, quote, influx of imported military type assault rifles, quote, end quote. So keep that in mind. And this is Steve Sansonetti, who signs this letter because Bill Ruger's in the hospital, and he seems to be the one handling a lot of PR after the March 30th letter. Though based on these terms, and based on what he said later, I think he's just cleaning up Ruger's mess. And we're going to get a little bit into that when we look into Neil Knox. Neil Knox is a prominent figure in the NRA before starting Firearms Coalition, different from FPC, I think. Pretty sure they're different website and everything. He testified in tons of congressional hearings for gun rights. Quick little rant on him, I've seen his name more than NRA presidents at the times. Through the 60s to 90s, I see Neil Knox's name a lot, whether it's when he was a gun writer for gun magazines, whether it's when he was with the NRA and moved to D.C. to start lobbying Congress, whether it was when he was kicked out of the NRA for being a little too pro-gun and he started his own group. I see his name a lot, so I don't think he has any reason to lie about this. He's just, in my opinion, calling BS when he sees it, but if you don't believe him, don't believe this part. But I believe him personally, but keep that in mind with my bias analysis. Gun Week, December 1st, 1989, Sammy had, first off, Steve Sansonetti, Ruger's general counsel. He said on Gun Week, December 1st, 1989, Sammy had the stance of magazine bans of magazines 16 rounds and over as of April, and Steve said, quote, the anti-gun media have said virtually nothing about the Sammy position. The plain and simple truth is that the magazine substitute hurts the goal, which is the banning of the guns themselves, so they have played it down. In fact, the New York Times even called the president's blatant switch to focus on magazine capacity as opposed to firearms himself a victory for the NRA, end quote. Steve also said, quote, he said, quote, I do think Bill is pushing a plan that would protect his business while affecting his competitors, and I do think he's damaging the efforts of those of us attempting to stop all proposed bans. So this is showing, whenever he's replying, he's just trying to clean up Ruger's mess, because he is Bill Ruger's general counsel, so he's trying to clean up the mess, even though he clearly disagrees with it, according to Gun Week, December 1st, 1989. So Steve himself is disagreeing with stuff. So keep that in mind. The April 12th letter had Bill Ruger's influence. And according to Neil Knox, in his book, which is written of interview with his son, that his son wrote, and using a lot of primary sources, Neil Knox gives him, I believe it's called Neil Knox and the Gun Rights War. And according to that book, Bill Ruger, aka William Ruger, the guy we're talking about, called Neil Knox the night before the letter was sent to Congress, end quote, after citing the many federal, state, and local bills to ban detachable semi-autos were, I want to save our little gun, which he later described as the Mini 14 and Mini 30, end quote. This is what Neil Knox said happened. Bill Ruger calls Neil Knox. And that quote is exactly what he said he started talking about. Bill and Neil started arguing about this significantly because Neil was not wanting to appease the gun lobby. Then, quote, Bill finally said, Neil, You're being very negative about this. I replied, Bill, I feel very negative about it, end quote. Well, actually, end quote of that. Then he, quote, he got angry, then said, well, somebody's got to do it, and by God, I will. And the next day, he sent his letter to the Hill. A few weeks later, he talked Sammy into supporting undefined regulation of magazines over 15 rounds, a vote that might have gone a little differently if any produced high-capacity magazines is the standard for either rifles or pistols, end quote. And there's a lot of quotes in there. That's why I kind of screwed up the quoting for a second. But that's what Neil Knox said about it. So according to that, he wanted to do it to save the Mini 14, and he talked Sammy into it. So he's actually the one who got Sammy on the mag bandwagon. And when you take this info in, it gets a bit different because he's proposing it more to save himself rather than everyone else's gun rights. And there's a lot of effects on Ruger after the letter. And in American Handgunner magazine said a person submitted to the magazine and said, quote, I note that Bill Ruger has called for a ban on large capacity magazines. I'm sick over this. I am an owner of Ruger products, and I've helped sell thousands of his guns. I ask you to stop accepting advertisements from Mr. Ruger's company until he rescinds his anti-constitutional proposal. I am asking dealers in my area to stop ordering Ruger products. I'm asking people not to buy Ruger products. This may seem harsh, but we are going to lose our rights if we do not all fight together, end quote. In the same issue, the Industry Insider section, the author of that, mentioned he disagreed with Bill Ruger pushing a magazine ban. And this was in the September and October edition of American Handgunner magazine on page 13 and 126. The response is in the November/December edition, which I'll be linking to towards the end in the sources. And Ruger's response, so Ruger actually took the time to respond to American Handgunner magazine and said this. Steve Sansonetti responded on behalf of Ruger. He argues Sammy and Ruger's magazine ban is, quote, is one part of an alternative plan to fight the good gun, bad gun approach, end quote. And I'm going to quote, and I'm going to say this, Sammy companies mentioned, which are mentioned, because he starts talking about Sammy takes our position too, and he mentions the following, including, quote, include Browning Arms Co., Federal Cartridge Co., Hercules Incorporated, Hornady Manufacturing Company, the Marlin Firearms Company, O.F. Mossbergs and Son, Omark Industries, Remington Arms Company Incorporated, Smith & Wesson, Thompson/Center Arms, Weatherbury Incorporated, and the Winchester Division/Olin Corporation, end quote. So all those companies are mentioned as Sammy companies because he's trying to legitimize the mag ban as a plan Sammy had too, trying to use them as credibility for Bill Ruger's action. And they may have supported it via Sammy, though they didn't openly support this gun control action from what I could find. They're mentioned as Sammy members by Steve Sansonetti. Quote, we are opposed to any gun ban, imported or domestic, and we are continuing to fight these measures, end quote. So why did you never fight the import ban and even not argue the terms to Congress when you're doing your April 12th letter? You kind of put them in a separate side from the legitimate sporting rifles. You didn't try arguing that at all. So that's clearly BS in my view. And, quote, we urge your readers to think about this and to remind them we are on the same side. No person is a staunch supporter of honest citizens' right to keep and bear arms of his or her choice than Bill Ruger, end quote. That's debatable, as supporting a magazine ban is more of a FUD position. And again, they're still kind of separating the legitimate semi-auto rifles from the military type ones. So that's a very debatable quote, though Bill Ruger, as we've examined, has said some pretty pro-gun stuff against gun confiscation. But some of the after effects, Ruger said in 1994, quote, "People kill people, not guns." He makes a point that, end quote, he makes a point that Ruger is for, quote, "responsible gun owners. We don't stamp out Saturday night specials in some back room," end quote. He says, we at Ruger don't make assault type guns. Media needs to not glorify gun and violence and these goddamn cheap imported guns. Which he's talking about Saturday night specials. I did the voice because that's kind of how he sounds to me. Kind of sounds like a FUD version of Hank Hill, to be honest. And quote, "No honest man needs more than 10 rounds in any gun," end quote. This is reportedly from a 90s interview. I didn't find that interview, but I found quote of it in the congressional hearing. Believe it or not, I don't care. There's a lot of sources, a lot of stuff he said directly. We could focus on this one. I'm not focusing on it that much because I couldn't find the original interview, but it's been quoted a lot and it hasn't been argued. But believe that part or not, I don't really care. I don't even care that much about that specifically because there's so much other evidence we're looking at. Ruger Company was still kind of fuddy in 2001. According to one thing I found, they had no plans to ever release a subcompact article. And the article blamed Bill Ruger, but, as soon as his son took over, stuff did start changing, and they sell stuff that would piss Bill Ruger off. Tactical Mini 14 suppressors, etc. Most anti-gun thing modern Ruger did was support the Fix Nix Act, like many NSSF members. NSSF is like a gun rights organization for gun manufacturers, and they're protecting gun manufacturer rights mainly. So they like to support stuff like fixing nicks anytime they can, so they get the good boy points. But that's a lot of manufacturers. That's the only real anti-gun thing modern Ruger's done, and a lot of makers have done that. And my analysis will kind of likely piss off Bill Ruger fans, the true believers. But after all this, I kind of see him as a based FUD. He's anti-gun confiscation and registration. And some of his ads were definitely not politically correct and kind of based and ballsy to post. But back then, safari hunting and stuff was not as demonized as is nowadays. But, insert the Ruger 44 carbine ad here. But him being against Saturday night specials makes sense, as many were against them in the gun industry at the time, including Samuel Cummings, interestingly. And he wasn't really for any gun control other than that, and recommending proof markings as a way to stop Saturday night specials. But it's kind of ironic, is Bill Ruger he's known for budget guns, but Ruger guns are quality even though they're budget guns, oftentimes budget guns, not always. Kind of like Taurus if it was more reliable and worked more often. But personally, I believe Neil Knox's statement about the Ruger letter is, when I found out about him, I realized I've seen his name more than any individual on the pro-gun side testifying in congressional hearings to protect gun rights nationally. It's really fucked up that Bill pushed this to save his rifle and not all the semi-autos. That it kind of shows it wasn't out of love, but kind of trying to appease it by sacrificing magazines to protect the Mini 14, according to what the Neil Knox stuff says, which, again, personally, I believe you don't have to. This is to help you make your own opinion, but this is my biased analysis. And it seems like a smart business decision, comparing the foreign rifle / Colt AR as assault type guns and his guns as legitimate sporting rifles. So if his plan failed with the magazine ban, they might at least separate his rifles, and Sammy members' rifles is different when they propose bans on, quote, assault type rifles. If you don't believe Neil Knox, that's fine. It might still be reasonable to see him as a FUD or to a supporter if you don't believe that. But, again, trying to give you info, but this is my bias analysis. Last time I'm going to mention that because you probably have gone sick of me clarifying that 8 zillion times. And, additionally, the Saturday Night Special ban would have given him a major advantage as Ruger had to have budget options out there, unlike Colt and Smith & Wesson. Didn't really take advantage of making too much of a budget option in their guns. There was probably concern if the guns are too cheap to make, they're going to end up used in crime more, as historically cheap guns tend to always be the most common ones used in crimes. And his anti-gun side, I think it was a mix of business strategy and FUD bias. Business strategy was telling Congress about his tariffs, so his and U.S. manufacturers can compete better, even though lots of military surplus is better than the U.S. products sold. And magazine bans to hurt his competitors, as he is not making magazines over 15 rounds, except to law enforcement. And with the Colt AR stopping production in 1989, a fresh import ban, Mini 14 gives him an edge in the market. His FUD mindset comes in with the way he will consider the AR-15 a, quote, assault type, end quote, gun. He wouldn't sell standard capacity magazines for his Mini 14 to civilians, at least since 1989. I didn't research too deeply into that part. The perception he seems to have of himself as a strong supporter of the Second Amendment, but his support of the Second Amendment is an approved list. He clearly doesn't include magazines there. He's not too eager on going out of his way to defend assault-type guns. On top of that, April 12th letter was wrote by his general counsel, but by the language and all the other stuff I've talked about, such as the assault-type quotes in there, it's very likely he was involved in drafting the letter. I mean, look at his quote in Gun Week, December 1st, 1989. There's a lot of stuff to suggest he had his foot in there, and it's still his company at the end of the day. I'm sure Steve was getting some approval from Bill Ruger here and there for a lot of that stuff. And, Bill Ruger, he was against gun confiscation. He was against registration, but he was pro-magazine ban. He is against cheap guns. He was pro-tariffing imports. He didn't want some compact semi-autos being sold. Anyone today we would consider a FUD for that or anti-gun it. But this was a different time, trying to judge him in the time. That's why certain things I'm not as harsh about. Like the tariffing, I'm not as harsh about, because at least you could still get that stuff in theory. And it was less bad than Sammy. The Saturday Night Special stuff, a lot of people like to target those as kind of the thing to appease the anti-gun crowd. There's just a lot of things like that to keep in mind with this stuff. And to me, he kind of seems like a based FUD personally. But he shouldn't be remembered just for his retarded FUD side. He should be remembered also for his contributions to the gun market. The .22 target pistols are the most common kind in America, if not one of the most common .22s in America. The Ruger 10/22. A lot of fathers taught their kids to shoot with Ruger 10/22s because both of them were cheap guns and good to learn the fundamentals with. Is cheap, affordable guns that are pretty good quality for the price. And on top of that, single actions were kind of brought back because of Bill Ruger's desire, and the hunting cartridge handgun stuff. Bill Ruger definitely helped with that, with the Black Hawk and a lot of that stuff that they made. The Mini 14 survived every assault weapon ban I know of in the States, so he got his wish for now that they're not regulated the same as the, quote, assault type, end quote, guns he claimed to defend, but always made sure to put them in another category from from the Mini 14 and his, quote, legitimate hunting rifles, end quote. Thank you so much for watching. Please share, comment, subscribe if you think I've earned it. Share the video out. I'd appreciate it. Till next time, this is Historical Gun Weave. I hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks.